Okay. Well, hello, Yate, everyone. My name is Valerie Shirley, and I'm moderating the session today with Nikki Tooley. I am one of the team members for IndigiFEWS at the University of Arizona. I'm also faculty member in the College of Education within Teaching, Learning, and Sociocultural Studies. And I'm currently directing a program with Dr. Jeremy Garcia on the Indigenous Teacher Education Project. So we're currently working to prepare Native teachers to teach in in schools that serve Native students. And I'm happy to learn more about this work on decolonizing food, energy, and water systems, and also thinking about the innovative ways that the arts can also be implemented into the science, technology, engineering, and math components. And I would just like to welcome everyone to this panel session. We have a great list of panelists here, and I'm looking forward to learning more about the work that they do. And so, in order to, within this online platform right now, it's a little difficult and it's new for some of us to be in this digital format. So in order to encourage the humanizing process of being in such a space like this, and for the panelists to also see who's also in the Zoom room, we encourage you all, whoever has good broadband connection, to turn your video on, in particular the IndigiFEWS trainees. And I know some of the participants are coming in or zooming in from the Navajo Nation, and their broadband connection might not be as strong. But welcome, everyone. I wanted to also have our co-moderator, Nikki Tooley, also introduce herself as well before we move into the session.
Nikki Tooley, and Purajin in the Shlong Tatnezakni Bashis Chin, Hashkahanza, Eta Shache, Ado, Twaheklini, Eta Shanale, and Lepestok, Legendeski, Sto, Sech, Ijet, Nasha, University of Arizona, the Inish Tap, a Hehet Land, that Isonof Sam. Yo estoy agradecido de que así como reconozco mi identidad como navajo, también reconozco mis antepasados mexicanos. Hay fuerza en la diversidad y hablar el idioma de mis antepasados me ayuda a recordar a la familia y la comunidad de donde vengo. Bienvenido y gracias por participar en esta sesión. Hi, my name is Nikki Tooley and I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. I come from the communities of Blue Gap, Arizona and Rock Springs, New Mexico. I'm a PhD student at the University of Arizona in the Department of Environmental Science, and I'm a part of the IndigiFEWS traineeship working with Dr. Sharon Magdal and Dr. Carletta Chief. Thank you for your interest and participation in this session today.
Thank you, Nikki. So this session is focused on contextualizing innovation within Indigenous communities through science, technology, engineering, art, and math. And in particular, when we're thinking about decolonizing, we're thinking about the innovative, creative ways that we can begin to transform our communities, particularly those who have been marginalized within society. And so, we're thinking about developing innovative, creative approaches to, in particular, FEWS in this case, but within the program that I teach in, we're also focusing on a decolonization process that encourages the teachers to also become more aware of history and how that has impacted their identities and shaped their thought processes along the way. But we're also looking to rebuild and transform our communities through positive energy that's so needed within our communities. And so collectively, I've been so moved by all of the speakers within this co-infused workshop since Monday. And I'm very honored to be a part of this and learning also in this process as well. So when we think about historically what has happened within Western science, I'm drawing on Linda Weiss-Smith's work in her seminal work on decolonizing methodologies. She says that Western researchers extracted and claimed ownership of indigenous peoples' knowledge, imagery, and objects. In turn, Western researchers distorted, misrepresented, misinterpreted indigenous peoples and their cultures. For these reasons, ensuring ethical conduct is essential in conducting research with indigenous communities. So, decolonization is understanding and being aware of that history and becoming critically conscious of that. But it's also having this sense of empowerment and a vision for the possibilities of what can be changed. And so I'm happy to introduce our panelists for this session. We have Dr. Christine Ami from Diné College, Dr. Kim Talbert from the University of Alberta, Wahala Johns of Native Renewables, Nonabat Lane of Navajo Ethno-Agriculture, Emma Robbins of Dig Deep and Navajo Water Project, and Sunny Dooley, who is a Diné cultural expert and storyteller. So I'm going to hand over the platform to Christine Ami to give a brief introduction.
Yat eln so don net nishnige touchini nishma ado bilagana that bashichin tohiglini dashiche ado bilagana dashinale Tazani lukajoke kedahatin ado adseheli dishogan. It's wonderful to be here with you guys. Christine Ami Dashichinne. I have a cool little video that I put together of my student work, so I'll go ahead and play that video while I'm giving my introduction. So I'm hoping that you guys are able to hear and see that. Hopefully I can do a screen share. Keep your fingers crossed. Let's see. Maybe.
I just allowed multiple screen shares since, yeah.
Thanks everybody for coming and joining us today. Today I'm going to be talking about the perspective of STEAM coming from a Navajo cultural arts perspective. And one of the things that we really need to keep in mind is that we're dealing with compositions of Mother Earth and Father Sky, and we're looking at how our four elements, right, of earth and wind and water and fire come together in order for us to create these arts, and at the same time teach us both traditional livelihoods as well as subject matter that would dialogue with, let's say, our K through 12 or even our higher learning educational experiences at the university and college levels. And so one of the things that I would like to really pinpoint off to everybody who is listening is when we deal with our cultural arts, a lot of times it gets segregated, it gets put into a box, it gets put away into a special corner of campus. And we can't do that with the cultural arts. The cultural arts actually infiltrates, and from my perspective, right, is the core basis of who we are as Navajo people and as people, you know, coming from an anthropological background, as who we are as people. And so one of the things, you know, that we need to truly take into consideration is how can we start to better dialogue and create these links that help, you know, students ultimately understand the world around them as well as the world that they can't see, right? This extra intellectual realities that we experience as Native peoples and as Navajo people. And so those are the things that are at the forefront, at least for us here at the Navajo Cultural Arts Program. From a personal perspective, I was never a good, what we consider, right, an A student or even a B student in our STEM subject matters going through high school and even into college. I mean, I had a lack of motivation, I had a lack of understanding, I had a lack of, you know, all of these different types of noises that prevented me from, you know, superseding to make those types of connections and to perform as well as I possibly could have. But if you were to put me into front of a sheep and ask me to butcher, I can demonstrate my knowledge of anatomy. And if you could put me in front of a loom and tell me to weave an moss rug, one of those twill saddle blankets, I can sit down and I can do that for you. I can explain to you how turquoise has different colors varying from greens to blues and what type of minerals, right, make up those exchanges. I can tell you how moccasins, right, that they ground us down to the earth and they ground us down to the sky. And I can tell you all of these things without knowing that I'm engaging with what we would consider from a Western perspective as STEM disciplines. And so with the integration of the cultural arts, what we found here at Dene College is that students are learning herbology, students are learning hydrology, students are learning how to manipulate and work with fire. They're learning how to work with geological formations. They are integrating, right, themselves into curriculum that has before been presented to them in a very Western format, but now they're able to do it through a Navajo perspective, thus integrating them back into their own cultural settings. And I think that that's the cool part, because students here are able to reconnect with their cultural identity, and they're able to do that through hands-on experiences that are going to contribute to who they are as Navajo community members in the future.
So that's just a little bit of a montage of a lot of our student work here at the college. Obviously we can go into detail, but I don't want to take up too much time during introductions right now on how we actually integrate all of these science teachers and lesson plans with our cultural arts classes.
Yeah, Christine, we look forward to learning more about the kind of work that you're engaged in. Next, Kim Talber.
Hi, do you have my slide you can put up so I don't have to do a screen share? If not, I'll just speak from it. It would be slide 2 on what I sent you. So what I had sent was a, oh, this is interesting. Yeah, the next slide. So this is just a slide that I use in a talk that I give on our summer Indigenous Genome Training Program that I've been a part of since 2011. I have historically worked on Indigenous energy and environmental issues, but in the last probably 15 years, I've been more focused on human genome stuff. But regardless, I think the sort of four points I want to bring out today from this slide are also drawn from the previous work in environment and energy that I did. So I've engaged in my career both as an environmental planner, and then as an academic with Indigenous communities around the world, but particularly in lands now occupied by the US and Canada, across many different science and technology fields, and have drawn common lessons across that. So I just wanted to highlight some terminology that I think people use a lot, and I don't think we all are on the same page about exactly what those terms mean. And so I'm drawing from a couple of sources, or I think several sources. The first one is a quote from Rauna Kokkonen, and Rauna is, and I'm probably not exactly pronouncing her name correctly, she's Sami, she's from Finland. She's been between Toronto and back in Finland, so I'm not sure where she is now, but Rauna has this quote that I use that I think we can unpack, and it's, all this text is here. She says, conceptually, indigenization represents a move to expand the Academy's still narrow conceptions of knowledge to include, that's a key word, Indigenous perspectives in transformative ways. Well, most often when we're talking about inclusion, when it's in the Academy or if it's out in industry or any other place where Indigenous perspectives are supposed to be included, this is not happening in transformative ways. So that word is key. And then I'm going to go to an article from 2019 by Adam Gaudry and Danielle Lorenz, and they're both Indigenous academics in Canada. And they wrote, this paper is really very interesting, and I can give somebody the full citation if you're interested in it. They break down what indigenization versus decolonization is, and they break down the different stages of indigenization. And we use that word a lot in Canada. I think you're probably using it a lot in the US too. But they say Indigenous inclusion, that's really the first level. That's where a lot of universities are at, equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? And so they say indigenization is conceived of primarily as a matter of inclusion and access. And by merely including more Indigenous peoples, it is believed that universities can indigenize without substantial structural change. That is the main barrier that we have encountered in the summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics, and listening to all our young Indigenous scientists and aspiring scientists and what they go through in the mainstream university. So you can't just rainbow up the lab and get change. That's the problem. The second level is reconciliation indigenization. So once we move past mere inclusion, what's the next step? And many universities are moving towards this step as well. Quote, what sets reconciliation indigenization apart from mere inclusion is an attempt to alter the university structure, including educating Canadian, and you could say US American, faculty, staff, and students to change how they think about and act toward Indigenous people. We can't just include Indigenous people and then carry on with business as usual, because really who needs to be educated about the barriers to Indigenous inclusion and justice in science and technology? It's not us. We know what the problems are. It's non-Native people. The third level that I don't believe we've really gotten to quite so much yet is decolonial indigenization. And this is where you run up against the difference between indigenization versus decolonization. But they combine them both together into decolonial indigenization. And they say that brings about the repatriation, right? The giving back. We think about repatriation in reference to bones and artifacts, but we can think about it in relationship to Indigenous land and life as well. Some of the best Indigenous scholarship, I think, or not scholarship, but critical thinking and analysis is actually happening on Native Twitter. And we're also seeing this on Black Twitter with Black Lives Matter right now. So if you know how to use Twitter well, you can get a lot of really incisive analyses going on there. And I think they're sometimes at the forefront of doing the really radical analytical work we need to do. So we need to think about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. I brought up Twitter because land back, hashtag land back, is one of the key kinds of hashtags you can look for ideas about how you repatriate land and life. Decolonization, they say, or this is from Tuck and Yang. This is another famous article that's cited a lot. Decolonization is not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. The easy adoption of decolonizing discourse by educational advocacy and scholarship, evidenced by the increasing number of calls to decolonize our schools or use decolonizing methods, turns decolonization into a metaphor. So I'm always really careful now when I use the word decolonization. Am I talking about repatriating land, resources, and life? And life can be a multitude of things that I think other speakers will have examples for. If you're not talking about giving back, you're not talking about decolonization. So I really want us to think clearly about what we're doing. It's not just putting beads and feathers or Indigenous motifs and patterns on things. It's a lot more than that. It's about returning what was taken in the process of colonization. That's land, resources, and lifeways. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tallbear. Next, Wahela.
Hi, everyone. Everyone that put this planning and organizing this conference together, and really happy to be a part of it. She'e Wahela Yinshia Ashihinishle Dog Ashe Bashishin Kizlane Dashacheado Kia Ani Dashanella. I'm Salt Clan, born for the Red Bottom people. I'm from northeastern Arizona on the Navajo Nation, an area called Twinjone, which means beautiful water. And I also spend half my time in Oakland, California on Ohlone land. And so I am the executive director of Native Renewables, and we've been an organization company since 2016 that formed with co-founder is Suzanne Singer, and she's Navajo from Gray Mountain and also Sand Springs area on Navajo. And I met her, I would say maybe 5 years ago, and she used to live here in Oakland, California. And we both had this idea of forming or working around clean energy. And since then, we've been building Native Renewables because we saw lack of or access of renewable energy education, renewable energy opportunities, so that we can build our capacity, so that we can, you know, see more solar, especially in the Southwest. We have like over 300 days of sunlight. So we wanted to be able to be a place where we can support communities that want to go solar, support families that want to use solar to power their homes. But, you know, I think the integration of, you know, our understanding of who we are as Dene people or Indigenous people is really aligned with our values as with the natural laws that are in place that we honor every day, every morning, with the sun, the Mother Earth, and the Father Sky, and all the elements, water, and the seasons, and the time of the day. All of that, you know, is also guided by the sun and the role that the sun plays in our livelihood. And I think that when you go and learn more about the teachings of who we are as Dene people, it just is very simple. And I think having the combination of using our traditional knowledge to guide us, you know, it's a guiding, it's kind of like a, what do you call it? It's like our planning process, you know, using design thinking. And that's how we've been implementing our teachings as Dene people in our work. And we've been using, you know, I love this theme of using art and STEAM. And we've been using a lot of different techniques to talk about how, yeah, like we created a coloring book. I don't know if you can see that, but it's called Nihitfa Jona E, but it just talks about our traditional knowledge of the sun and our historical understanding and narratives around the role of the sun and the hero twins. And what we wanted to do is create this, you know, this coloring book for all ages, intergenerational, to understand that there is these teachings with the sun that are available, and that we don't, you know, if we combine the science part of and the technical part of solar energy, it can be very beneficial to us. So that's a little bit about what we do and how we've been integrating Indigenous knowledge with this new technology. And yeah, I think that's all I have.
Okay, yeah. Well, Wahela. Nona Botlin.
I have to unmute myself there. Can everyone hear me? Yat Nana Botlin, yeah, Tkatnisa Nanslint is a Fana Bush's chain. Kia Ani Ishiche Dolby between and I am talking to you from the Navajo Nation. I am in the northwest corner portion of New Mexico on the Navajo reservation. And this is where our family farm is. And it is where I started with my family. I co-founded Navajo Ethno-Agriculture. And it is we are a teaching farm. And the premise, the primary reason why we started this farm goes a lot back to research that was being taken from our families for the traditional knowledge and for the traditional crop knowledge, for traditional water knowledge, for traditional earth science knowledge. And this happened right before my very eyes, probably about 5 years ago. And I had this discussion with my mother because she was sharing so much information with non-native scientists and non-native researchers who were coming in and just taking so much knowledge from her. And one day I said, Mom, what are these people? What do they want? What are you doing? And I said, you can't do that. It's so much stuff that you're just not getting, you don't know what they're gonna do with it. So immediately we started to act. And we became this pretty unique organization because my father having 40 years in Indian education, he's a former teacher, and my mother being a retired nurse, and then myself with the environmental science and engineering and entrepreneurial background, and then some other family members who all have this kind of just wealth of non-native, I guess, like Western academia and education kind of like training, combined with our traditional Navajo background, is like became this very powerful tool that we now use to partner with other tribal colleges and a prep school and Massachusetts Institute of Technology, because these are the institutions that have kind of like the same value that we do at putting Navajo culture at the forefront of their teachings. And so we have a pretty we have a planned out syllabus. It's an upper level science course that's taken. It's dual credit through Navajo Technical University and Navajo Preparatory School. And we also host students year round from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, so that they can learn kind of the cultural perspective and the humanity of just being in the community, and how their knowledge and kind of their talent can be useful at different levels and different kind of socioeconomic scales in the world. So that is how we're part of the kind of the Western science portion. We also have a pretty, I guess, well-developed, I would say, citizen science project going on within the Navajo farming community here. And with that, we use a lot of kind of background research that Dr. Carletta Chief has kind of been doing for a long time. So we're really appreciative for her support on a lot of the stuff that we do. And so we're carrying that out more at a local level, and are very engaged in kind of the technology that Massachusetts Institute of Technology has to offer for our project and with our project, and also kind of creating pathways for students interested in attending institutions like this. So we kind of our mentorship program as well in that sense. And that is pretty much what we are doing in the academic space. But as an immediate response to the pandemic, we are focusing 100% on growing food and also creating a community supported agriculture system right now with other growers and farmers on the Navajo Nation. So.
Next, Emma Robbins.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so honored to be here with everybody. So many bad Navajo women on here. So just to follow with my clans, yat eshe Emma Robbins yanishya, Biligana nishle, Hashkan hadzoke bashichin, Biligana dashiche aldona kaidene dashinade, Tkonestese de nasha. I am the director of the Navajo Water Project, which is under the umbrella of the nonprofit Dig Deep. And we are based here in LA on Tongva land, where I currently am. Under normal circumstances, I split my time between the res and California. I have been with Dig Deep for about 4 years, and the Navajo Water Project is obviously on the Navajo Nation. Across the res, we have projects in Natsitzan, specifically Paiute Mesa, right on the border of Arizona and Utah. And we have a project in Dilcon, and then a project in 9 chapters surrounding the Theru area. So all across the nation. Dig Deep does water projects throughout the United States, but our flagship project is the Navajo Water Project. And we help families who are among the 30% of Navajos on the nation who don't have running water get safe, clean drinking water in their homes. And so we do this through a combination of things, whether it's installing off-grid home water systems, which are basically a pretty simple setup, but there's a 1,200 gallon cistern and then a series of plumbing, a pump, a filter, a heater, and then families have 1 sink. For families that don't have electricity, we build in a solar component there. And so that way, you know, the pump is powered, and also families have LED strips in their homes and charging ports for, you know, cell phones and whatnot. And then we also help out with bill pay, which obviously is a really big issue right now. I know that the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, or NTUA, has a moratorium on water shutoffs, but that's something that people need a lot of assistance with currently, because just because there's a shutoff doesn't mean on moratorium on shutoffs doesn't mean that you don't have to pay the bills later. And yeah, it's been definitely a learning curve. I'm really excited to hear a lot about what people have talked about, especially starting their own projects is really helpful for me to learn about it. I am also an artist myself, and so over the past couple of years, I've been figuring out how to incorporate the fine art element of my life with the Navajo Water Project. And so it's really important to me that the A was included here in STEM, you know. So yeah, really excited. Thank you.
Yeah, Emma. Next, Sunny Dooley.
Yeah, it's A. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, it's A. Shea, Twitter Conjures in the Anishla. So, Tobahaba Kia Ani, Etan Kinesa, Dotra Chitney A, then Gisto, Tasha Che Bedishna. Ado Tanaha Bishni A, Tashinalado, and this cheap behind this that is up around the Ayanasha. I am from a community 23 miles south of Gallup called Vanderwagen. And I've lived there all of my life, traveled all over the world, sharing Navajo stories. I started this particular aspect of my life in 1982 when I tried out for the Miss Navajo Nation pageant to earn a college scholarship. And I did traditional Navajo storytelling as my traditional Navajo talent. And the pageant committee said no such thing exists. You need to weave, to sing, or tell a joke. And I didn't know for myself that the art of storytelling was a tremendously powerful healing craft that has really been ignored in so many aspects. And I want to point out two things, and it does talk about decolonization, and it does talk about people taking our wisdom, knowledge, and incorporating it into a different sphere. And I think that when I started this professionally, 10 years later in 1993, I asked 3 of my clan brothers who were Hoijonja chanters if I could do this in public, because the Neh Navajo stories were reserved just for family, and it was a family's treasure. And what I noticed in 1993 was my Diné nation was falling apart. Our language was beginning to decline. Our traditional cultural practices were in decline. And there was this enormous speed of development wanting to take place with no real clear cultural direction. And at the same time, I unveiled for myself that much of our ceremonial wisdom and traditional knowledge were stored in museums, and only if you were a PhD candidate or a master's student of some university, you had access to it. And I thought that was tremendously unfair and sad, because I don't even know if those elders were given permission. Around the same time, I started touring various universities, and I discovered that I was dismantling a lot of academic stature, because it was the first time here was a Navajo woman who has Navajo as her first language, who grew up Navajo, was basically addressing people who had studied my culture, and I was correcting them. And they did not like it at all. And so this is how my work has been. it has been the most satisfying way of making a life for myself. I've told a story in every single area of the Navajo Nation. Since then, it has been my goal to do that. And I've been privileged to travel with my stories, and I feel like I travel with my ancestors on the premise that the three medicine men gave me when I started this work, which was these stories are not to be advertised. Ado isa azlaud eya hodneto. There has to be reciprocity when you tell a story. Adot anan leti e ado pahalne. Don't tell these stories for no apparent reason. And I followed that protocol up to now. It's 2020. I believe I've had almost a 40-year history of doing this work. I love it. And the last thing that I want to say is this: just because it isn't written down and stored somewhere on a shelf, it's not anymore invalid or valid. I have yet to write down my stories. I maintain the oral tradition. And I think that's the last frontier that we need to address. When an elder tells traditional wisdom, because it's not written, doesn't invalidate it. Because it's not written from the Dene worldview, it still is powerful. It's not dead. And that's what I love about integrating art into STEM, because art is energy. Art is what motivates change. And art is that soft cushion that helps people evolve to the next place. And right now with COVID-19, we're in a huge worldwide transitional state. And I am looking forward to our next evolution. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Sunny. I would like to begin now with the questions and asking Dr. Talbert, Wahala Johns, and Christine Ami. So we'll start with Kim Talbert. The question is, what can the physical sciences and engineering disciplines learn from the social sciences on innovation and/or Indigenous contexts and knowledge systems? What are the challenges and benefits with this effort? And what are examples of the synergy in action? Dr. Talbert?
Sorry, I had to find myself and unmute. So you ended up combining two questions, I think, that you'd sent me, right? So and I was hoping somebody else would go first because I know you all have different examples. But first, okay, so I'm going to combine these first two questions. But first, I forgot to introduce myself and where I'm coming from when I gave you my little spiel about decolonization. So I just wanted to say that I'm a citizen of the Sistenwaptin Oyate. That's a Dakota tribe in the east of South Dakota. But our historic homelands are also in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and I was partly raised there. But I'm coming to you from the University of Alberta in Edmonton, where I've been for 5 years. That's Treaty 6 territory, and it's the traditional gathering place for Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota, Iroquois, Dene, Anishinaabe, and Inuit peoples. So it's a really diverse Indigenous landscape, but very dominated by Cree and Métis around here. So, so the questions are, I'm going to go back to them now. What can the physical sciences and engineering disciplines learn from the social sciences on innovation in Indigenous contexts and knowledge systems? And then the second part, I think, was challenges and benefits. with this effort. So I can talk, the second part I can talk a little bit about, use the example of our summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics, which some of the people on here may know about because we've got heavy Navajo or Dene participation in that, because you all turn out so many scientists and engineers. It's really admirable. But the first part, you know, that's a really good question. What can the STEM fields learn from social sciences and humanities? In my personal experience, having worked as both a planner and as a social scientist and humanist, I wonder if the scientists that I've worked with haven't in fact learned more from thinking with Indigenous knowledge holders and theorists, and I use those words loosely. I don't make a distinction in my language necessarily between the academy and the community all of the time. And when I write essays or books, I talk about Indigenous thinkers quite often. And that can include academics like me, but it can also include people in community who I view as doing really important theoretical work. So for example, when I was really, you know, when I observe Idle No More, when I'm observing what happened at Standing Rock with No DAPL, these global Indigenous environmental movements worldwide, what's really clear to me is that you've got a lot of community people doing incisive analytical work. They are some of our greatest theorists of what Indigenous lifeways have to offer the world in terms of relating better with each other, relating better with non-human relatives, and giving us better ways to live. So I'm not exactly sure that STEM fields can learn as much from social sciences and humanities as they can learn from that. Now that said, what I bring to our summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics, since I'm not a scientist, I'm not a genome scientist, I am trained as a social scientist and a planner. What I bring with some other ethicists is a curriculum on exactly what decolonization might mean in relationship to doing science, to running labs, to doing science policy, to publishing, to mentoring younger students. And so some of that language that I bring to our decolonial bioethics work, for lack of a better word, does come out of the social sciences and humanities. And one of the things that I found is that even Indigenous scientists, I work with a lot of Black scientists, other people of color, queer scientists, disabled people, anybody who's been marginalized by the scientific project, whose bodies and cultures have been portrayed as deviant and overstudied by usually straight white male scientists. I work with those kinds of aspiring scientists. And what I've learned in working with them is that as diverse as people might be, as oppositional to the power structure as they might be in their own lives, when you get into the sciences and engineering, you don't get trained in the theoretical language that will necessarily help to dissect the political power structure. That is something that we are better at in the social sciences and humanities. So I have really gravitated towards working with scientists who are also interested in cultural studies, in studying political economy, and studying critical race theory. And believe it or not, there are young scientists coming up, graduating, getting postdocs, becoming assistant professors, starting labs, who are also trying to keep a handle on those kinds of literatures and ways of thinking. I think having studied anthropology and having studied biology a little bit, one of the main differences I note is that in the hard sciences, quote unquote, people tend to forget the history of their discipline. They tend to focus on the successes, on the knowledge that they now hold as valid, and want to call pseudoscience, and I don't think it is pseudoscience, the older science that has been found to be faulty or that has been disproven. And some of that stuff tends to get excised from the memory of the discipline. Whereas in fields like anthropology, for example, they've also made a lot of mistakes. They've done a lot of really racist, hierarchical stuff. They tend to keep those mistakes and those missteps within their canon, within their body of knowledge. And when you study for-field anthropology, you learn about those mistakes. You learn about those missteps. You learn about the histories of race science. I don't find the same kind of retention of historical mistakes in the hard science fields. And I think that's a real problem. Where you're going to go to learn about those mistakes and the advances that have been made and the sort of overcoming racist science is you've got to go to anthropology of science. You've got to go to sociology of science or history of science, humanities and social science fields to get that. So that's quite useful. I think I might, unless I have time to talk about the SING program, do I have time, or should I stop for now and come back later?
I think, thank you so much. I think we'll go ahead and move on to Walea for now, and then we'll come back after, after Christine. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Hey again. So I think that there's so much benefit from Indigenous peoples informing science community. I think if there's one group of people that know the land best and their environment is Indigenous peoples, it's said that 80% of the biodiversity in the world is on or near Indigenous peoples' lands. And you can see that in the Southwest for sure, you know, where we have our own language that describes everything in a really beautiful way in regards to nature. So we have a nature language, and that's pretty much embedded in all Indigenous languages. And I think that's key to understanding the way that we move forward, especially in this time of climate change. And, you know, I got into this work around protecting our aquifer, the Navajo aquifer in Black Mesa, Arizona. And it was based off science and data of drawdown of our groundwater from Peabody Coal Company that had been using 3 million gallons a day, you know, and how the impact was having on all the springs throughout our communities. And, you know, I don't have a science background, but, you know, I read that report several times, and and when you start to, you know, have that knowledge, I think that of the impact that it's culturally having on your, you know, water, your springs, your way of life, then I think that's an indicator of, you know, how we move forward to solve a critical issue that might hurt and harm the stability of our aquifer and everybody that depends on it, not just people and humans, but the complete cycle of life there. And how does this relate to also, I think, in my environment, like climate change with the bark beetles, they're taking up all of our trees, you know, in where I'm from. And I think that's something that I worry a lot about. And but it's also, if you know your environment, you understand that there's this connection. And I think that's what is our challenge today, is to use science and our Indigenous wisdom together to make informed decisions that will protect our communities today to sustain themselves. And I think, you know, my own practice at Black Mesa is really around also learning how to build my home using Adobe, using passive solar. And, you know, you can combine them. You can combine science and engineering to fit the way that we live as Dene people in the Southwest. So our homes stay cool in the summer and warm in the winter. We have off-grid solar that can provide power, and we have water nearby, a spring, and then we can also, you know, get water from the local wells. And I think that having that system and a food system is really important in the way that we can combine, you know, this technology and resources like funding and support to get our home. I mean, that's where the heart is, right? Especially in this time of COVID, is, you know, we really want to protect our home. And I think that's the major kind of, I guess, more important focus for myself and for our communities, is to how do we best sustain home. And with our initiative, you know, we have made really robust systems, like to withstand freezing temperature, high winds, high heat. and they're off-grid solar units. They're about 2.1 to 2.3 kilowatt systems with battery storage. And they can power a refrigerator, can power, 1 to 3 bedroom home. And this isn't, we've learned from a lot of people that have contributed to how we design these systems to sustain for 20 years. And I think right there, that's this knowledge has been in our communities for over 30 years with solar technology, with Deb Tewa and Brett Isaac and different people who have contributed to, helping to design a sustainable way of producing power. And I think that's powerful there, is that we have our own people in our communities that have this skill set that we can lean on. And that's what we've done as far as Native Renewables, is bring up our leaders within the community that have this wisdom and support them in this path of, I think on the decolonizing pieces, to be self-reliant and self-determined. And that's what we're trying to focus on each home, is that the families can own their power and they can regulate their power.
Okay, thank you, Walea. Next, we'll move to Dr. Ami.
I'm sure glad I agreed to be part of this panel. It's really good to be back in the sphere since I've been so immersed in the arts for so long. This really speaks a lot to my graduate studies. I am a Native American Studies major, graduated from UC Davis, in which I was studying both animal studies and animal science. So with that background, working with butchering as the forefront. And the reason why I got into butchering and indigenous butchering systems is actually off of one of Kim Tallbear's lectures that I had overheard, was listening to how animal, it's not so much as how we live and how we die that is able to keep that cycle going. And those are the kinds of things that I've been able to work with my students here at Diné College, not just in the arts, but also I teach Indigenous research methods classes here. And so what we're really looking at is, in terms of this, we create, right, these sections, right, these disciplines. Even when I think about graduate school or even here on campus, right, the GCB is where our hard sciences are at. The NHC is where our soft sciences are at. And the big problem that we're seeing here, especially if we're looking towards decolonizing STEM and STEAM, is that when we look at like the arts, for example, as a demonstration of STEAM, you can't segregate them. They're not pull apart, right? You look at them as a whole, and you're able to analyze them, and you're able to analyze them through tribal center specific mechanisms. And so when we take a look at that, that's one of the things that I really push with my students, is the significance of tribalizing. A lot of times we can look at these disciplines that are put in two different categories, put in two different segments, in two different buildings, but through a tribal eye, you're able to reintegrate it all back into, so it's one fully functioning spherical entity. And so those are the things that I think that the social sciences helps to bring to when we start looking at our physical sciences. And this is also coming from an anthropology background too, so that I know how quickly you can dialogue from that. But the importance of tribalizing here is that sometimes we get so caught up in, right, pan-Indianism, and I'm not saying that it's not a bad thing, but what I am saying is that when we're trying to decolonize and when we're trying to re-indigenize these systems and teach our students the importance of storytelling, I think Sunny really hit on a great part, is that all that indigenous science is locked up in these stories. And if you're able to access these stories, if you're able to decode them, you are filled with a world of knowledge that can not only help you in this world, but it will help you in that transition, that 4-day transition after you pass away and into the next world. And that is a very power integration of the physical and the social sciences that we see. So like in my research, I teach an advanced Indigenous research methods class, which deals with both qualitative and quantitative measures. And so we look at the significance of tribalizing it and taking a look at our own research methods, because it gives a different perspective on what has been so forthright in Western science thrown into our face as this is the law, this is the scientific breakdown. I look at, for example, the reason why I got into butchering is because people kept telling me, well, sheep are from the Spanish. Sheep, you guys are just, you know, assimilated peoples. You don't have any knowledge of your own. And it just befuddled me because I know all these songs and I know the significance of keeping mountain sheep around but also keeping it separated from your own sheep at home. And we have all these fundamental laws and natural laws. And there are real consequences that I was watching growing up and even as an adult, that when we start to mess with those, you know, traditional knowledge laws and those fundamental laws, they have real livelihood consequences. So when I started going back and I started looking at like concepts of polygenesis and the fact that, you know, well, we have these different realities and ways of looking at how things came to be separate, right? What happens if we start making them dialogue? Concepts like evolution, right? When we start looking at evolution from an anthropological or from a tribalized perspective, we can start making these points of contact with physical science, right? And so not saying that they're going to become one, and I'm not saying that they're going to help us to solve all world problems, but it helps us to create these really important points of contact where we're able to facilitate dialogue. Because what ends up happening with the physical science and the social sciences a lot is that we get stuck in that debate phase of critical thinking, right? And then we just say, oh, well, those are the soft sciences. Oh, those are the hard sciences, right? And we're never able to really make that dialogue. And dialogue doesn't mean that you get along, right? Dialogue doesn't mean that, you know, you agree to disagree. Dialogue means that you're able to create that growth that's necessary in order to become self-resilient and self-determining. So those are the kinds of things that I see. So I ask my students when they come into class to reorientate themselves. I tell them, like, if I have any of my class students watching, hi, you know, go home, check your baskets. And they look at me and I say, no, go check your baskets. Go check your baskets and go check your pottery. Right? I wish I had a basket and pottery I'd show you guys, right? That opening in that necklace, that opening in your rugs, that opening, make sure it's facing the east. Change the way that you're seeing, right, what you're centering ground, because from a Western perspective, what's our compass? Our compass is the north. But from a Navajo perspective, our compass is the east. So we make our east our centering ground, and it doesn't change everything, but it changes your perspective. So you're able to receive that information in a very holistic manner. And you start to open up your eyes to see how we can start dialoguing, you know, the arts with our sciences, and things become much clearer. So if you guys are listening, go check your baskets, check your pots. Make sure the openings are pointed towards the east, because it does make a difference in the end. So I hope that helps to answer some of the questions.
Absolutely. I hear Dr. Ami. Dr. Tallbear, you mentioned that you had an example to share. Would it be appropriate to share it now, or do you think that it would be good at the end of the second question, because we do have a question centered around those examples and those different ways?
Yeah, no, you can go on to the next question and I can pop in if there's a segue for me.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next question that we have is, what does, and this is for Emma Robbins, Sunny Dooley, and Nana Botlane to answer in about 7 to 8 minutes. So what does decolonizing FEWS, innovation through STEAM, look like? What are some ways people today, after this panel, can begin that movement towards decolonization and indigenization? Okay, so we'll start with Emma.
I think, you know, this is something that I think about a lot in the work that I do, because, you know, the organization that I work for is not fully Native run. It's not fully Navajo run. And when I first came on, there were a lot of things that I noticed as a Navajo working on the Navajo Nation and being from the res myself that really needed to change. And, you know, when it came to these water systems, I work solely in water, a little bit of solar, but it was really important that we took ownership of the projects, right? Because it wasn't started by Navajos, and it didn't mean that it was going back into the hands of the Navajos or we were collaborating with people. A big part of my job is not only doing research into areas that we need to work in terms of where our projects could be a good fit. Do they have, there were a couple questions in here, but do they have a sustainable water route? Is there a safe water source? Are we going to be able to perform operation and maintenance afterwards, and so on and so forth. But one thing that's really changed is making sure that, we're not only employing Navajo staff, or we're not only using things that go beyond just looking into a database or speaking with IHS. It's really about speaking with the people of the community. And when we really started to do that, it was a really big shift because it was hard to find staff in a lot of the more rural areas that we're working in, just because people don't live close by, right? Like Paiute Mesa is a perfect example. I think a lot of us from the from the Navajo Nation probably know that that's a really, really remote area. And so it was hard to find people there. Doesn't mean it was impossible, but really going along with listening to the community rather than coming in as this outside nonprofit that had done work in developing countries like South Sudan and Cameroon, but saying, there were little modifications that we had to make once we were listening to people, like the 1,200 gallon cisterns that go underground. Before I started there, they were saying, well, obviously it needs to go underground because it gets cold and these systems can freeze, but we're going to go ahead and mound it because the ground is too hard to dig deep into. And that was an issue because, it looks like a grave site, and people whose homes we're working in are next to, they don't want to live next to a grave site for traditional reasons. I wouldn't want to live next to someplace that lives like a grave site. And so there are those little changes in terms of figuring out how to listen to people and not just come in and say, here's this Band-Aid and let's put it over with. Really figuring out how to use Navajo culture to make things sustainable, and to listen to our elders, and when they have input, to really just take that seriously and not say it's just about consultation, we're going to go this angle or this route. Really about embracing what we're doing. I think working for a nonprofit, a lot of times I can struggle because I'm on the project sides only. I'm not on fundraising. I don't really do much with that. And so making sure that when we spread these messages about what's going on in the Navajo Nation is also coming at it through a Navajo voice, and not using this poverty porn or white saviorism and saying, we're installing systems for families who don't have running water and these poor natives. And especially during COVID, it's really important that we talk about the fact that this is a year-round problem, and not only are these problems, but there are also solutions, and that there aren't just a couple unicorns out there who are working on these problems in terms of lack of water or energy. I think, this is a really great diverse panel, and all of us here who are doing this work know of other people who are doing the work, or have coworkers or colleagues or employees or people in our community. And so also really making sure to highlight those solutions, because I think being from the res as well, it's very easy to feel like there isn't a way to help your people, right? Like whether that means going off to college and being able to feel comfortable and supported there, when we can come in and say, look, these are Navajos, these projects are by Navajos for Navajos, this can work. It really sparks something in there. I think figuring out as well to not have people come in and tell us what to do, saying, we've had examples where engineers or consulting companies have come in and said, well, this is the only way that you can do it. They don't factor in a lot of times that some of the water sources that we're drawing from need to be mixed use, right? Because not only is drinking water very important to get for families, but also to get your sheep water, to get your crops water. It's something that we have to look at holistically, and understand that working on Native nations and the reservation is unique, and to treat it that way, because we do partner with people who are used to working in different communities that are marginalized or are experiencing extreme poverty, and they think it's totally the same across the board. And so there's really a shift that needs to happen. And I think in terms of moving forward with, I also want to say thank you, Dr. Talber, for that you know, that breakdown of definitions, because that helps me out as well, you know. And so really figuring out how we can decolonize and indigenize these projects and really put our money where our mouth is, because we see this so often when nonprofits come onto Native nations and they say, you know, oh yeah, we're consulting people. Consultation isn't enough at this point. It's really not enough. It's about braiding into the development of the projects, to the research, the execution, and then the operation and maintenance, and making sure that these are solutions that are tailored to every single community. You know, the Navajo Nation is a huge community. I've heard people say, I'm from the Northeast, I'm from the West, I'm from the Northwest. We are all so unique that something that's going to work in Dilcon might not work the same way that it does in Natsitsan. And I think it's just starting to take people seriously and not impose solutions. And that's something that can be difficult. And I think the nonprofit world definitely has a lot of work to do, the way that we function around that. Also with funding, you know, there's this sort of power dynamic where someone might say, well, I have the money and I'm doing this, so you need to let me come in and film, and you need to let me tell your story. And once we start changing those ways, these projects will be a lot more successful. In terms of the way that STEAM fits into it as well, I think a really big thing, being a fine artist myself, is that we need to start defining, we meaning Indigenous peoples, need to start defining ourselves as scientists, whether that's somebody with a degree or somebody who understands monsoon seasons and the way that farming works, you know, understanding that engineering can range from getting a degree as well to also figuring out what the best movement of your sheep might be. And then also in terms of the arts, I think really redefining ourselves as fine artists and people who can communicate these issues and, again, these solutions in a holistic way through visual language.
Thank you, Emma, for sharing your words. We'll be moving on to Nanaba Lane. Again, Nanaba, the question is, what does decolonizing FEWS innovation through STEAM look like? And what are some ways people today, after this panel, can begin that movement towards decolonization? Again, Nanaba, you'll have about 7 minutes to answer this question. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I want to echo everything that Emma said. When we formed our nonprofit, it was exactly for that reason. Like, we wanted to control, number one, our narrative. Secondly is to encourage and be role models and mentor our scientists, our future engineers, our future leaders, our future doctors. And we're in a time now that we have the capacity to do all of this work on our own. Like, we really do. There's no need for consultants to come and tell us what we know best. There's no need for scientists and researchers, non-native, to come in and tell us how we should develop our own science, right? So that is one of the main reasons why we do what we do. And we feel like our partnership with Massachusetts Institute of Technology hears us and they understand us. And we are so careful in the partnerships that we do take on. Like, it's not a, you know, people have this misconception that, oh, it's a Navajo learning farm, and let me just contact them, and so let me see how I can get some Navajo seeds, or let me see how I can, you know, see how they do their planting season, or maybe some chants. We've been asked over the phone to chant, and it's really disturbing. So I've learned a really kind of strong, very strategically planned vetting system now, and with this, we're able to kind of choose the people we want to, and especially with this pandemic. You wouldn't believe how many people are contacting us like every other day. It's just like out of the blue, because suddenly people want to know about, oh, I've heard that Navajo people are going back to their traditional ways of farming, and how is this impacting you, and how can we work with you, and how can we study you, basically. But the thing is, like, we've been doing this all this time. We've just formalized and developed an actual curriculum and actual partnerships, and have kind of like an online presence now. So that makes a really big difference, I think. And then also having like leadership and kind of board members who are all in the whole Indian community, the Native community, and to kind of help us to do all of this work. So that is really important to kind of be that. It's kind of we take it for granted, and I like that Emma brought this up because I would not have thought about it because I was just like, okay, this is the kind of work we do. But that is a really big part of kind of like owning your narrative. And we want to stress, and we like to stress to our students that you can do this yourselves too. Like you really can, and we will guide you to these options and these opportunities and this leadership that you are totally capable of doing. So that is something that I really wanted to express, is that we want to make sure that the upcoming kind of generations and the youth know that they are capable of doing this. And also with that, I have a little bit, and I'll probably get some pushback for this, have a real problem with the word decolonizing science, because I feel that Western science is needed. Like we need this in our communities. And when we start to use this type of terminology and verbiage toward the young people, it sends, especially like a developing mind, maybe junior high, high school, it might sort of steer students away in a way that's kind of like almost too aggressive, saying that the student, like, you can work together. We're not, like, I would never use that word with students, like, oh, we're decolonizing science. No, you know what, you just come here and, you know, this is the science, this is the soil. Today we're going to be testing soil. And why are we testing the soil? Because a long time ago, our grandparents had these ways of doing these things. And it's a bilingual kind of education going on too. So we're using a lot of traditional songs and traditional stories to get our point across. But also it's really important that we have these technological tools of advancement to help you empower yourselves to test your soil, to test your water, and then to build that capacity within your own communities so that you're not having all of this data and then who takes it away. So if you have your data, you become this community and you have control of this data. And this data is so valuable. And a lot of times this data is being taken away from our communities. And that's something it's kind of like a whole nother ball of fur. But we like to teach our students about what happens to this data. You know, there are a lot of studies out there, and I can tell you horror stories about where the data goes from science projects and research probably even 5 years ago. So that's another thing that we like to teach our students. And I think the main thing is that, number one, we want to be here to support our students. Secondly, is that we want to be that we're almost like a liaison right now between MIT and between our community students. And it's a really delicate dance. Like, it's not something we just say, oh yeah, we're gonna do this and you guys do this. I mean, we've had meetings, the highest, the dean, the president of the school, and we said, you know what, as long as you abide by these kind of guidelines that we have, yes, we will engage with you guys. As like the one time that goes away, we can't do it anymore, because it's almost as though we're putting kind of our community out there, because we feel like we have such an influence with the students. And it's almost like a protection mechanism, especially because we're working with tribal colleges who do have the Navajo culture at the forefront. So those are kind of my thoughts about decolonizing. Indigenizing, it's kind of a new word that I sort of kind of, I'm okay with. But I feel like decolonizing science is really kind of like overpowering. And it's fine though, because it also allows for us to discuss with students, like, how is it that you feel about these terms, and what do you think it means, and how is it that we can guide you to make this type of terminology or these type of thoughts work for you in becoming the scientist, or maybe you don't want to become the scientist and you want to become a farmer who's a hydrologist or a soil scientist who, you know, all of these professions that do involve science. So it's important, and I appreciate that, Dr. Tallbear, about you bringing those up, because I think those are some things that we will definitely be talking about and bringing up. And all of this terminology, all these new science terminologies around Indigenous science are things that we would be teaching and kind of focusing on. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Nanaba, for sharing your thoughts and for answering that question, and for even giving us thought to think even deeper into the terminology that we use to even begin to discuss these processes. And lastly, we'd like to invite Sunny Dooley to now present her thoughts within this question that has been framed, which again, Sunny, is what does decolonizing FEWS innovation through STEAM look like? What are some ways people today after the panel can begin that movement towards decolonization? And again, Sunny, you have about 7 minutes to reply to this question. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you again for organizing this very insightful conversation. I hope it continues after we have concluded amongst all of our communities, wherever it is we interact. When I was in 8th grade, I had to dissect a frog or a cat in my biology class, and I knew that that was a violation of my culture. So I went home and I told my mother and my father about my biology class and the cat and the frog. And I said, what do you think? And then my mother replied, is the biology teacher going to pay for any kind of ceremonies after you have committed this violation and disrupting your own biology by, really disrespecting the cat and the frog? And I said, I don't think so, but I can ask him. And this conversation took place completely in the Navajo language. And so I went back to my science class and I talked to my teacher, and I interpreted everything from the Navajo worldview into his language of English. And then he just really looked at me quizzically, and then he said, do you believe that? And I said, yes, I do. And I think I was so young, just unexposed to anything that, I was not swayed in any direction. And then he said, if that is your belief, he says, what do you suggest? And this mimics the question you have just asked me. What do you suggest you diagram for your dissection to pass this class? And I looked at him and I said, every Saturday we butcher a sheep or we butcher a goat, and we use the meat to live on for the entire week. And if you want to, I said, you can see me and my mother butcher a sheep or a goat on Saturday. And he looked at me and he said, that sounds like a fine idea, Miss Dooley. And so we made arrangements. I told my family just thought it was a little bit audacious, but he brought his family out. We told him that we lived out in the rough, and this is the reason why I personally don't go camping, because I grew up camping. And I said, we're going to be like at a camp. We don't have running water. There's no electricity. And we cook outside underneath the shade house. And so that's what we did. And I passed the biology class. And I think that those are the kind of innovative ideas that we can apply into our curriculums wherever we are at, and in whatever capacity we are teaching. And last year, June, I was with a group of young kids from a variety of different places at Diné College, and we had 2 sheep, giant sheep, that we ended up butchering. And it was so funny because the butchering started taking place with a young man who was working at the land office. And then I looked at him and I said, Shiyash, my son, where are the women that should tend to the fire, that should tend to the hot water, that should tend to cutting up the meat? And then he says, oh, I called my grandmas. And then when the grandmas came, they were quite elderly. And so I know that there's a real vacuum of, you know, able-bodied, strong young women who really need to start incorporating the traditional ways of anything into everyday life. And, you know, like with COVID-19 that has infiltrated our entire world, you know, which food systems are going to survive, which water systems are going to survive. And within our own family camps, have we identified the livestock that we're going to be able to eat, you know, next year? Because COVID is not going to give up until we really literally stop moving and start wearing our masks. That's when we slow it down. And that's science information. And trying to explain COVID in Navajo has been difficult. And so, you know, the way I live my life, I try to explain everything wherever I go, which may be annoying, but I know that this might be the only time I'm going to have this opportunity. Today, I drove to Window Rock to pick up my mail. There was a man selling nuppy right there at the borderline of Arizona and New Mexico. And I'm pretty sure he's selling that nuppy, which is OSHA root, because on the radio during a Navajo culture program, somebody said they made a tea out of it and they utilized it to regain strength, etc. I didn't have the opportunity to stop to tell him this OSHA root should not be exposed to the sun, because as soon as you expose anything to the sun that was coming from the earth, it begins to dry up and its intensity and strength begins to wane. So whoever buys that OSHA root from that man today at the borderline right there is just buying a bag of useless root. And I say that because medicine is made specifically for a person with reciprocity in mind, with intention in mind, with the purpose in mind. You just don't go out and get it. And so that's one of the things that, you know, comes from a storyteller frame of mind. And in everything that I've heard thus far, you know, here in the Southwest, the colony concept came over 500 years ago with the conquistadors. It's quite ingrained now because the colonization and the other word that you use, it escapes my brain right now, is so ingrained in our own cultural communities that we tend to hoard opportunities from one another. Everything that I have heard of from Wahela and the young lady who's doing the water thing, I haven't heard of them. And maybe it's because I live in a very rather quiet, simple life, but I would like to know, you know, I've lived without electricity until last year. March of 2019 was when I finally was able to, you know, put up the utility pole. And had I known there was an opportunity for solar, wow, I don't have running water. And when the city of Gallup closed its doors for 11 days, I couldn't haul drinkable water from Gallup because all of the wells in my community are naturally contaminated with arsenic and uranium. So, you know, these are the kinds of things that I think I don't know if it's just on Facebook or I'm not astute in that way, and I don't have that kind of social media platform, but how does the ordinary Navajo person who does not have internet access 24/7 know about these things? Thank you.
Thank you, Sunny, for sharing your thoughts with us as well in light of this question. As many of you see, we've reached that 2:30 time limit. However, the discussion that has been shared with us has been really insightful, and we're grateful for the opportunity that all our panel members have made this day. You'll see that there's a poll that has popped up. We appreciate your response to that. However, we also would like to acknowledge that we could spend another 10 minutes answering some of the Q&A that has been asked. And we understand that some of the participants, if you have to go, thank you for joining us for this session. However, for those of you who would like to hear some of the questions or pose a question, we'll go ahead and stay on an extra 10 minutes for that. Our panel has been pretty active in responding to the questions that have been put into the chat. However, one of our trainees the IndigiFEWS trainee has posed a question, and I'm not sure if Kyle can unmute himself now at this moment. Kyle, would you like to ask your question?
Hey, yeah, actually. So my question, I guess there's actually two of them, but the first question is, what do you see as the difference between STEM and STEAM in the context of, I guess, both kind of decolonization or incorporating traditional knowledge into these fields?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is Sunny. I would just say that science and everyday practical life in the Navajo way has always existed together. The reason I say this is because the sacredness of creation is integral. And so for me, science and the sacred have existed in parallel with one another. You can't take the science without the sacred, and you can't be sacred without the science. In our way, we have always held the two in common. Does that help or not?
So,
yeah, no, that helps a lot with understanding.
Just kind of to add to that, to Sunny's comments, is that so I was raised to know our traditional songs and our ceremonies and whatnot, and as an adult, I took that for granted. I mean, as a child, I took that for granted just because it was something that was part of life. But now, as an adult, wow, I see the intricate science behind all of that. I mean, our songs and our stories are even way more advanced, and like, we are the future and we are the technology in our songs way before Western science even acknowledges. So when I translate that in my mind, I can't, when I have that in my mind, I can't translate that to even the most technical Western science that I'm trained in, right? So there's a certain part of us as Navajo people, and maybe just as like Indigenous people, that we have, we're part of the earth in that way, and part of the universe in a really intricate way that is not easily translatable, and it's not easy to share. And a lot of it we are not meant to share. And what I was told by my father is that if you can't translate it, and if you can't have someone else who is not a Navajo person understand what it is that's so intricate, that for you to be translated, then you should not be translating it. And then it's not meant to be translated. That's meant for ourselves and for our knowledge and for our use.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sunny and Nanaba, for your response. So those are all the questions from the chat. Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question at this time? You can go ahead and unmute yourself or raise your hand.
This is Mark. I'm one of the cohorts. Can you hear me?
Yes, Mark, we can hear you.
Okay. I really appreciate this workshop today. I'm also working with Native Health in Phoenix, doing a couple of STEM activities as a volunteer. And I really appreciate that we had this discussion because it's trying to help me with some of my activities. And I already reached out to our Native Renewables lady who was our panelist, because I'm doing a solar energy project. By the next 2 weeks, the activity starts on the 22nd, and it's a 5-week thing I'm doing. So I wanted to integrate the coloring book with my students. I'm working with middle school students from 6th to 8th graders. So that's why I'm wearing a mask and stuff. I'm in the health area of the following protocols. So I just wanted to say thank you for all the panelists for being on there, and I appreciate everything. I will be in touch with some of you guys because some of my research that I will be doing, as I'm a PhD student in American Indian Studies at University of Arizona as well, and as a cohort of Indigenous FEWS as well. And I appreciate all my other colleagues, especially Nikki. She's an awesome lady. I mean, we'll probably be bouncing off one another as soon as we get our doctoral degree, right? So thanks for all the panelists being on there, and I hopefully you guys can see me on the Native Health Facebook. And I am going to incorporate a couple of Indigenous stories and tying it to our culture, but I'm going to try to keep it uniform because we have a bunch of different kids from different tribes.
Thank you, Mark. So I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Valerie, and she has some final thoughts as well as an announcement from Alice. So Valerie?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, everyone. Collectively, I think, the work that, every panelist has shared has really exemplified the ways in which, you as well as all of us are intentional in the collective work that we do to rebuild our communities in really positive ways that also works toward healing. And so I thank you so much for all that you've shared with us. And, we look forward to reading and learning more about the work. So hopefully we get another chance to engage in more dialogue regarding all of this work. And so I would like to turn it over now to Alice, who's going to talk about the agenda for tomorrow.
Thank you. Fabulous session. I really appreciate all of the speakers and also the audience who asked really insightful questions and then answered other people's questions. Just want to say what the heads up, what we're doing tomorrow. We're moving, we've been studying context in various ways, and we're going to move from going from the challenges to coming up with best solutions and understanding best practices. The first session in the morning, we'll have a joint meeting in which Yael Perez will run it and break you into 8 or 9 breakout sessions. So it'd be great if you thought about which breakout session you'd like to join. And then in the second session, we'll be doing a virtual field trip with some really great exemplars of collaboration on food, energy, water systems. So just want to give a heads up on what we're doing tomorrow. Hope to see you then.